Cameras have become more advanced over the years, but they've also become very consumer friendly. You can go out as a beginner with little to no experience and buy $1,000 camera and still shoot really good images by just using the auto settings. If we're investing all this money in this equipment, we should probably at least take the time to understand our tools, so to say, so that way we can get the best image quality without having to rely on auto settings. But before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe so that way you can make sure to get more photo and video tips in the near future. A little discretion. Any tips I give, they should be looked at as more guidelines. My philosophy in school was always learn the rules of filmmaking first so that way you can go out and break them creatively. My other discretion is I'm assuming you know your camera from inside and out. If you don't, I highly encourage that you look through your manual or you can look up some other videos for it. So now let's get started. Exposure is everything in order to produce an image. And this is where it becomes necessary to understand some basic photography fundamentals. There are 3 settings on your camera that will help control your exposure. There's shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Shutter speed controls the length that the sensor is exposed to light. The numbers are usually portrayed as fractions of a second. As the numbers get larger, the images get darker. That's because the sensor is getting less light exposure. The smaller the number, the brighter the image, but the more motion blur is going to be captured. I could dive into this and go into a bigger explanation, but I feel it's best served for another video. Aperture, and sometimes known as f-stops, refers to the amount of light that's carried through the lens to the sensor. If you look closely in a lens while you play with the aperture, you'll notice the hole getting wider or smaller. That's what's controlling your aperture. You'll notice as the numbers get smaller, the opening gets wider and becomes brighter. But as the numbers become larger, the hole shrinks and the images get darker. Smaller hole, less light. Larger hole, more light. If you notice on your lens, there are these numbers. You'll find something with an F and a number. That indicates the widest aperture that you can go on your lens. If you notice on this lens, it says f1.4. That is pretty damn wide. But if you notice on this one, it's f2.8. Still good, but it could be better. Then there's ISO. All you really need to know is that smaller the number, darker the image, larger the number, the brighter the image. So now that you understand these 3 functions, here's how they affect your video production. Shutter speed should never be touched. The rule of thumb is you want to set your shutter speed to double your frame rate. And with most cameras, you probably can't get the exact number, so try to be as close as you can. Depending on what you're filming will determine what your aperture is. If you're filming yourself, capturing something in the distance, or doing run and gun type filming, you probably want a smaller aperture or, a higher f-stop. My suggested f-stop for this situation would be anywhere from an f8 to an f16. Like I said, the smaller the hole, the less light comes in, which will help make sure that whatever you're focusing on stays in focus. If you're at home filming B-roll or shooting close-ups or want to do more cinematic looking images, then I suggest shooting very shallow and going with a lower f-stop or a bigger aperture. By doing so, it'll create a really creamy looking background, very nice and blurry, nice bokeh, and it'll give your foreground subject a lot of separation. For my suggestion, stick with a 2.8 to 4, but be careful if you go with a really wide aperture because the focal point becomes very, very small. If I were to focus on me right now at a very high f-stop and then I move suddenly, I can go right out of focus. You can mess with the ISO, however, I highly recommend you do it at the very end as a last resort, but in the end, just make sure you have enough light. Resolution refers to the frame size of the image. The current digital video standard is 1920 by 1080p. A majority of content you see on TV and online are presented at 1080p. And most cameras on the market, if not all, should have 1920 by 1080 as a standard video resolution. And there's also a larger resolution called 4K, which is becoming the new standard in most cameras. 4K is double the size of 1080p. It also has better quality and more detail in the image. It's definitely proven a point and gone past the gimmick phase. However, I would be cautious because not all TVs, monitors, and displays are able to project at 4K. And on top of that, most viewers aren't going to notice the difference between 4K and 1080p. As long as you light your image well and expose it properly, 1080p should get by. And even though it sounds like I'm against 4K, it's more of just, you don't have to make it a main selling point for why you have to buy buy that camera or why you have to deliver your videos in 4K. For me personally, I deliver all my videos at 1080p because I know that's the standard. I know that's what everyone's going to be able to see it as. However, I film all my content at 4K. By shooting in 4K and then delivering at 1080p, it gives me more freedom to manipulate the 4K footage on my 1080 timeline. It's not a necessary workflow, so at the very least, film and edit everything at 1920 by 1080. Frame rate, or frames per second, is the concept that video is just a bunch of smaller images put together. Every country and media industry has its own standard. Here in the US, it's 23.976 or 24 frames. I have noticed in the digital era that a lot of YouTubers tend to do their frame rates at 30 frames. And one way you can look at it, 24 frames, it takes 24 little pictures to create 1 second. Whereas 30 frames, it takes 30 images to make 1 second. So the fact there's 6 more images within 30 frames, it means the camera is able to capture more movement. But either frame rate you use, just make sure your shutter speed is double your frame rate. Personally, I've always filmed at 24 frames. Part of it is just a habit. However, when I film B-roll, I always film at 60 frames per second or higher, and then I slow it down in editing to 24 frames to give it a really nice slow-mo effect. And this is something I'll cover in a future video. White balance is an absolute must before filming or taking photos. Light gets emitted in different color temperatures, and if your camera is not set properly, your image will come out very blue or very orange. If you don't properly white balance during production, then it makes color correction in the editing phase a pain in the ass. It's not necessarily hard, it just takes more effort to color correct something that's already been baked into the image. So if you can always remember, just white balance ahead of time. Pretty much every camera has auto white balance, and they also have a slew of presets for different scenarios like daylight or cloudy day, and I highly encourage you use those presets versus auto white balance. Once you finish setting up your lights and setting up your camera to the lighting, bring a white piece of paper in or a white object, check your camera, make sure that it looks natural. What you should then do is record a few seconds of that object, and then in editing you can use that as a reference point to white balance. Personally, as I've gotten better at understanding lighting and just having a better camera, I actually don't use any of those presets, and I manually adjust my white balance. Like I said, it's because I understand the lighting, but also I just like having the creative control for it. And there you have it. These are the basics that I feel you need to be thinking about before taking a photo or a video. All these steps put together will make a really great image, and I highly encourage you take the time to dive in and understand every little detail. If you guys like my tips, make sure to like this video and definitely subscribe, because I'm going to be making more videos like this. And of course, make sure to comment below and let me know what tip really helped you out. So until next video, see ya.